we have a generation of men who want to use their presence and their power and their creativity for the benefit of other people. They want to do that, but they don't know how. And so I said, well, I'll at least give them a framework for what that can look like.
Welcome to Socrates in the studio. I am particularly excited, as I think you will see. I honestly get so excited about this subject. I was thrilled you wrote about it. So before I tell the audience what it's about, why don't you do that and how you came to write the book?
That's a great question. Again, thanks for having me on the show. You know, we have about 350,000 men currently in fraternities in this country.
Wait, now?
Today.
350,000 men in fraternities today. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, in about 4,000 chapters, and I see this as an opportunity to do two things. One is to make university life better, but also to produce the next generation of America's leaders. Because if you look statistically and historically at the history of fraternities and the types of men they produce, it's something like in the 70 to 80 percentile of all CEOs, all members of Congress, all presidents and vice presidents. If you look at the Supreme Court, et cetera, where do those men come from? They come from fraternities. And so when we sort of talk about the crisis of men and masculinity in America, I'm thinking, well, one of the best places, I think, to resurrect the sense of producing America's leaders is fraternities. Now, I came to write the book because I was concerned that a number of fraternities were getting suspended. In fact, what I noticed in the news cycle, this is before COVID, is that once a week, somewhere in America, a fraternity was being suspended, like every single week. And I thought, what is happening with fraternities? And I began to look at the data, and as you look at those stories, I began to see these patterns, right? I mean, they were being suspended for hazing violations. They were being suspended for alcohol abuse and things like that. And at the King's College, I taught a class on the history of masculinity in America. We did a unit on the history of fraternities. And when I looked at the history of fraternities and I looked at the current expression of fraternities, I was confused at the disparity. Right. And what's fascinating about the disparity is that in the beginning, fraternities were organizations that were primarily literary societies. So men
in the 19th century.
In the 19th century, in the early to mid-19th century, fraternities were places where men would come and read Socrates, they would read Aristotle, they would read the classics, and they would debate them together. This is what they would do for fun. In fact, the libraries in a lot of fraternity houses were better than the libraries at the university. So it was a sort of a finishing opportunity for men of arts and letters to prepare them for leadership. And what I noticed when I looked at the narrative and the story is that fraternities began this way, and then we found ourselves currently with all these suspensions. And what I noticed is that in 1978, and you will remember this, there was a film called Animal House.
The only reason I remember it was because it was required viewing by people in my high school. You know, like everyone had to go to see it. And I guess I thought it was 1979, but maybe it was made in 78. But it had such a powerful impact that when I entered college in 1980, where I went to school, everywhere they were doing toga parties, which was okay. So this was one of those films, Animal House, and I'm glad you brought it up because obviously I was going to at some point. It really was a cultural landmark. It's like a film like The Godfather, that it's more than just a film. It basically affects thinking about college life, about fraternity life, obviously, and was very influential, probably mostly for ill, but it had huge cultural impact.
It had a massive cultural impact. In fact, I'm willing to say that the reason that we see some of the challenges with some chapters on some schools is actually because of that film. We can trace it back to that.
Oh, no question.
Because what happened, right? As you said, a bunch of middle school and high school boys watched that film in 1978, and they said, when I go to college, I'm going to do that.
Right.
And then they went and they did that. And every fraternity film after Animal House is a variation on the theme of that film. It's probably, I would say, one of the most impactful cultural films,
Yes.
sort of projects in modern American history.
And for people who don't know what it's about, because there are tons of younger people watching right now who, they were not around, or it's so far back now that they don't, they think it's like a classic film from the 30s. That film glorified drunkenness. I mean, in a lot of ways, this gets into a larger conversation about media and the glorification of bad behavior. But you had one of the biggest stars of the time, John Belushi, who was one of the main figures on Saturday Night Live, starring in this film as a kind of a model of debauchery. Like, that was his thing, and it was cool. It was, cool, funny. That whole idea was pushed very, very strongly in the culture with a principal figure. And then you fast forward, 20 years later or so, and you get Will Ferrell, another huge figure in films and in SNL, appearing in a similar film called Old School or whatever. But it definitely started with Animal House.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating, to me quite sad, is that what we see in Animal House, that is not what fraternities are about. In fact, I was in fraternity when I was in college. We weren't about that. Most of fraternities at Clemson were not about that. But that genre, that media project, has really sort of stereotyped in a negative way what fraternity culture is like. So here's a problem. There are lots of parents who are dissuading their sons from joining fraternities because of that film, and they're missing out on all of the good things that fraternities could possibly produce and provide. And so I wanted to get back, this crazy project I have to try to sort of infuse virtue back into Greek life. It's a crazy project, but I just believe that we have a generation of men who want to use their presence and their power and their creativity for the benefit of other people. They want to do that, but they don't know how. And so I said, well, I'll at least give them a framework for what that can look like.
Talk a little bit about your own biography with regard to fraternities. You said you were at Clemson, because obviously that's what gives you the principal credential to weigh in on the subject. So talk about that. You were at Clemson, and what was your experience in what's called Greek life? Since I'm Greek, I always have to pause. It's like, no, it's not about that. It's about frat houses, and maybe you can actually, before that, tell us why it is that, tell us about the word fraternity, but then tell us about why did they adopt Greek letters so that we now know of, fraternity life as Greek life. What was that?
That's
classical influence in the 19th century education?
That's exactly right. So fraternity started at Union College in Schenectady, New York. There were three men who were veterans, and they missed the camaraderie of serving together, serving in the military. And so they got together at Union College and decided to form a fraternity. They met with a professor in his office and said, hey, we want to do something. And because at the time, sort of being grounded in the classics was so normal, unlike it is today, that of course they wanted to sort of resurrect sort of Greek influence of camaraderie and brotherhood, kind of deep connection and community. And it was out of that. It was out of a longing for camaraderie and this strong sense of brotherhood that they chose the word fraternity.
Okay, so this is 1824 in Schenectady. A bunch of veterans. Now, I don't know, what war were they in? The War of 1812, or I guess maybe they were just serving in the military together, and then they decided to go into university. We don't need to talk about this now because I want to talk about your Clemson experience, but it is fascinating that men seem to long for brotherhood, for camaraderie. There's something in men that longs for that. And that can be for good or for ill, obviously, as you write about in the book. So I want to touch on that because that's so fascinating that that's how it all started. But what was your, what pushed you, as a very young man at Clemson to say, I want to be in a fraternity?
Well, I mean, I was like a lot of my students, sort of seeking a deep connection with a group of brothers, sort of have a pact, sort of have a tribe, right? You sort of want to be a part of a group. Guys want to be a part of a group. This idea that sort of Americans are individualists and kind of lone rangers is absolutely false, right? Guys want to be a part of a group. In fact, from way back, they were like the Little Rascals, if you can remember that program,
That's
right?
one of the greatest things ever. Hal Roach, our gang comedies, that's like the greatest ever. I didn't think we were going to go there. Thank you.
Well, you can go from there to the Three Stooges. I mean, all the way to Happy Days. I mean, sort of all these media projects, right?
Yeah.
Sort of explain, and you can see the deep longing that guys have in the community. It can be for good or ill, like a gang, for example.
Yeah.
Right?
But Hal Roach's Our Gang was innocent. So it's kind of funny. The word gang has taken on this thing, but this is my gang, this is my group, this is my, and there's something really beautiful about that, and that is particularly masculine, that there's something about guys that long for having something like that.
Well, and I've seen some great psych data on this. What essentially happens is that when men are deeply embedded in a community of support with brothers and sort of comrades, if you will, they're much more willing to take risks. They're much more willing to be brave. They're actually much more willing to be compassionate and empathetic. They're much more willing to put their lives on the line for others. They're actually much more likely to live out the cardinal virtues when they have a community around them to encourage them and push them, right? To encourage, right? To put courage in them to be great men. And great men cannot be great without other men. It's absolutely impossible. We've never seen it in American, in not just American history, but in the history of human culture. We've never seen a culture where men have been great outside of a community of men to put courage into them to do amazing and outstanding things. And guys want to be heroes. They really do. I mean, we are in a season of Halloween and costuming. And what do you see kids do? Boys put on costumes often of heroes. And they have this intuitive sense, this sort of intuition that I cannot be a hero alone. I can only be a hero when I have a squad with me, right? And so what do? They want to join a community of men to make them great. They have that intuition. And when I was in college, there's someone who had aspirations to be a leader, things like that. I knew because of the history of fraternities, particularly in the black community. So I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha Incorporated, which is a historically black fraternity. Some of our most famous members are Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King Jr. You may have heard.
What? Some of our most famous men? That's pretty famous.
Yeah, you may have heard of W.B. Du Bois and people like that, right?
Also W.B. Du Bois?
Yeah, our fraternity.
Is there any fraternity in the world with like three names like that? That's kind of impressive.
It is impressive. We have more. Are you kidding? There's a long list.
At Clemson.
There's a long list of men and Alpha Phi Alpha who've essentially changed America, but that would be a different conversation.
Yeah.
But my fraternity was founded at Cornell in 1906. And it served as one of the Divine Nine. So the Divine Nine is a collection of historically black fraternities and sororities that really saw themselves, one, as forming leaders out of college to be placed in the community to be leaders later, secondly. So when I was growing up, I mean, part of what it meant to be an African American in the community was to be a part of Greek life. I mean, my mom's in her 80s. She pledged Delta Sigma Theta, and she still goes to sorority meetings once a month. So in the black community, Greek life is not simply about the first few years of college and then sort of ends afterwards. It's sort of college is the preparatory phase for pressing into being a community leader. And so during the civil rights movement, for example, the fraternities and sororities in the black community were heavily involved in organizing and fighting for freedom and justice and things like that. So when I was in college, sort of growing up in a community in Atlanta where sort of postgraduate Greek participation is really, really high, I thought, well, it's a natural thing for me to want to be a part of. As an African American, one of the Divine Nine Greek organizations in order to be a leader in this country.
I know Thurgood Marshall was at Howard University in 1930 because Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he came to America, he visited the South and visited Howard. So that's another thing to mention, is that when you join a fraternity, you're joining a fraternity that connects you not just to that chapter of that fraternity in that college, but that connects you to all the fraternity brothers across colleges, across that's kind of a magnificent networking. If you did it only for networking possibilities, that's an extraordinary thing that Alpha Phi Alpha, is that what you said? That would be a connection to all of these people, throughout the country and all the alumni. So that's a very interesting. In other words, that would just be a very attractive reason for somebody, to join a fraternity.
Absolutely. It's a huge draw. I mean, to know that you will be a brother in a fraternity, which puts you in a legacy of great men. Yeah. And here's the thing. High school guys want to be great men. That is just a fact. The problem is they don't have a good roadmap for that. And few people are investing in them and encouraging them on exactly how to do that. So one of the big issues I've had in terms of how we relate to young adult men is we encourage them by negation. What I mean by that is, don't be bad, right? Don't mistreat women. Don't haze your brothers, right? Don't abuse alcohol and drugs, but they aren't telling them what to do.
Right.
They aren't giving them the virtues of greatness and excellence. They aren't giving them prudence. They aren't giving them, sort of justice. They aren't giving them the cardinal virtues. It is formation by negation, which is not formation at all. And so we have a whole cohort of young men who are trying to figure out what to do, what to be with this sort of heroic impulse that they have. And what they end up doing, we're seeing this right now, is they're on YouTube trying to figure it out. And so that's why we want to ask, why is it that college men are so driven to these influencers on YouTube? It's because there's a vacuum. You should do a book on this maybe. There's a vacuum of instruction on how to be an outstanding and excellent man. There's like nothing out there for them. And so they're joining fraternities to try to recapture some of those virtues and to join a legacy of men who've proven and demonstrated that they've done it.
I sort of did 2 books on this subject. I did a book called 7 Men and the Secret of Their Greatness, and then a sequel, 7 More Men and the Secret of Their Greatness, which are short biographies, because sometimes you can help people get virtue, or get the concept of virtue as they read stories of greatness, right? You read a story of greatness, and without telling people it's this value and that value, you see it and you kind of pick it up. So that's, in some ways, for the same reason you wrote this book, I wrote the book 7 Men, because I thought we lack in our culture a number of the things you've already mentioned, but we don't talk about virtue. We don't model virtue. We now denigrate virtue. If anything, we're going to denigrate or mock virtue, or these kinds of heroism. It's mocked. And as you're saying, men in particular automatically respond to this kind of thing. And so that's why I wrote those books. But your idea of using the Greek system, the fraternities that already exist, as a delivery system for this, I think is genuinely brilliant. It's amazing. And that's why I was just so excited to talk to you about this, because it really is. It's simply a great idea. It's an amazing idea that these things already exist. And if we could get any number of them to begin thinking along these lines, and then even the fact, as you say in the book, that there's historical precedent. They used to be shaping men in a good way, and it's only really in our lifetimes that this has kind of gone sideways.
Every single campus that I speak to a fraternity and I invite them to a heroic life of virtue, they almost come out of their skins in excitement. And on almost every campus I go to, this is the sort of response that I get, because I say, hey, again, why don't you use all that you're about, right? Use your power, your presence, your creativity, all that you have, right? Your strength, use all of that for the benefit of your brothers in your chapter and everyone else on campus. Whenever I invite them to that, I get a standing ovation every single time. And this is what they say to me: no one talks to us like this. There's no one inviting us to be great men. No one believes in us. Right. And so what I tell them is, like, I believe in you, and I believe that you can actually use the virtues and the values and the mission of your fraternity, because they're back. You know, these were developed in the early to mid 19th century, so they're sort of classically Judeo-Christian. All of them. All of these fraternities have fantastic values and virtues and mission statements. And if they plug back into those, right, it will not only change the campus, it'll change the country, because out of that cohort will come the next generation of America's leaders.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say now, and to read in the book, that you are being invited to speak at colleges around the country on this subject. It's interesting that their response is that nobody's talking to us this way, because I mean, let's face it, the culture has gotten profoundly confused on these basic issues. Even when you mention masculine traits or whatever, there's either confusion or derision. And I'm just so grateful to you for turning that narrative, because the hunger is there, as you've just said.
Well, I think what happens is that so much of the current cultural discourse is about how bad men are. Not just the word toxic, but unnecessary. Yeah. And that men make things worse. Yeah. And think about, your average 20-year-old, 18, 19, 20-year-old has grown up in a society and a culture, yeah, where they've only heard how bad men are. Yeah. And they've just experienced shame and rejection. Not encouragement, right? But rebuke and shame and rejection, because you're a mistake. And if we could just get rid of men, the world would be...
no wars, no serial killing. How great that would be. You use a term, I wrote it down in the book. You talk about disordered masculinity and the purpose void. That's the issue, isn't it? That you and I, men of faith, we know that God's idea of masculinity, or the traditional Judeo-Christian view, or even the Western view of masculinity, is fundamentally heroic. It's fundamentally meant to be not self-serving, but selfless. That's the model. Obviously we can talk about chivalry. That's been there for the longest time, and it's only recently, in a way, that masculinity has been defined in terms of toxicity. I mean, I don't know if it's worth getting into, but how that happened.